morning, and welcome to Tuesdays with the Pilgrim as we continue reading A Prophet in Babylon by W.J. Dawson. Chapter 20, The Pool and the River. Butler's Inquisition, as he called it, during the next few weeks continued its work with remarkable vigor. In his heart, Gaunt was not wholly sympathetic with Butler's methods. His nature was too tender. His spirit was too loving and charitable for the exercise of judicial functions. He often thought that moral suasion would have succeeded just as well, that, in fact, men like Stonecroft might have been persuaded to righteousness. But he knew, nevertheless, that the facts were against him. Had he not himself preached for 7 years to Roberts? And yet Roberts was on Butler's blacklist. Had he preached plainly and boldly enough? His conscience acquitted him on that score, and yet in spite of all, Roberts had gone his own way and done evil in the sight of the Lord. This was the eternal anomaly, and his soul was saddened by it. How explain it? And the more he thought of it, the more clearly he saw that the moral failure of the pulpit lay in its lack of authority. The preacher preached professionally, and, therefore, no one thought of taking his words seriously. Moreover, he had no power of enforcing them, being himself the paid servant of the men whom he addressed. It was different in medieval times, when the Church knew how to enforce its laws, and did so relentlessly. It was different in the days of Jonathan Edwards, when the terror of the unseen world lay on men. But the fear of that unseen had long ago been dissipated. The vision of the great white throne, of a judgment seat, of a hell for evildoers, all had melted like a pageant in the sunset clouds, and there was left only the hard, bare sky. Slowly he began to see that social redemption could only be achieved by the restoration of moral authority, and he could not but admit that Butler's work was an effort to create a center of moral authority. As for Butler, he had no doubts. "If you had been an editor as long as I have," he said one day to Gaunt, "you would know that life is a pretty rough business, and cannot be carried on without rough measures. You've not got over the debilitating effects of being a minister yet, my friend." Gaunt laughed at the word debilitating. "That is about the last word my critics would think of applying to me," he said. "Oh, you're improving," said Butler sardonically. "But you'll never quite make up for the lack of locusts and wild honey in your education. You've had too much soft raiment in kings' houses, you know. You've got rid of them by the mercy of God, but you can't get rid of their effects all at once." "I rather thought a famous editor knew more about those things than a poor parson," Gaunt retorted. "Oh, yes, an editor no doubt gets a pretty fair share of the rewards of life when he succeeds, but that's not what I mean. What I mean is this, that you've never until recently handled life with naked hands, and I've never done anything else. You've been brought up by all sorts of notions about the beauty and kindness of human nature, because in a church human nature seems to the average minister an amiable thing, delicately nourished on angels' food, with some defects, no doubt, but with no brutal instincts. So the average minister living in a sentimental world sees everything through the glamour of sentiment, and speaks and acts accordingly." "And an editor?" asked Gaunt. "An editor has no illusions. Take my life. Ever since I was 16, I have been handling life with naked hands. Forgive the repetition of the phrase. I mixed with thieves and pickpockets, followed the clue of the repulsive crime, discovered corruption where I looked for rectitude, have found men to be self-seeking, greedy, and unscrupulous. Life, as I have seen it, is not an amiable affair at all. It is a strong, brutal, terrible thing. It's a tremendous battle in which the fiercest passions are at work. Oh, it can be heroic, too, I know, but fear lies at its base. You must make men afraid of something if you want them to move to a higher plane of living. The soldier fears to be thought a coward, therefore he flings his life away. The merchant fears the rod of justice, therefore he controls his greed within the bounds of law. In the highest state of development, men fear the rebuke of conscience. They fear the disapproval of God. And then you get the saint. The love of God is the last word of wisdom, no doubt, but the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. My particular work just now, as I conceive it, is to put the fear of God into the hearts of men like William Stonecroft." What about Stonecroft? Oh, he's a good case. I think he'll come around to our point of view. I've kept careful track of his doings, though. Of course he doesn't know it. He's dismissed that brute of a manager. He's closed one of his houses, whose evil reputation was notorious. Stonecroft is an easy case, because he is at heart a good man. He sinned not wilfully, but through criminal carelessness, the carelessness of a man who grows wealthy too fast, and leaves to others the management of his affairs, and doesn't trouble about the details. If I only had to deal with men of his order, I should have no trouble. But I'm no prophet if we are not going to be up against the worst kind of trouble with some other men on my list before many weeks are over. Gaunt grew serious at once. Tell me what you mean, he said. I've nothing very definite to tell you at present. I'm only conscious that a storm is brewing. From what direction it will break, I can't tell. Here, for instance, is a letter which shows the sort of spirit which is at work. He handed Gaunt the letter. It was typewritten and anonymous. It was composed with a sort of sober violence, a cold, unexaggerated vindictiveness, much more impressive than any wild or whirling words would have been. The writer remarked that he and many others were aware of all Gaunt's plans and movements. They had nothing to say against his work as long as it was confined to its own proper sphere of religious activity. He warned Gaunt that if he passed beyond that sphere of activity, there were those who would remorselessly crush him. They had the means, they would find the way. For the present they contented themselves with warning him that he was in greater danger than he imagined. If he made it necessary for them to strike, they would strike hard and mercilessly, and the blow would come in such a way that no precautions he might take would enable him to avoid it. As Gaunt read the letter, his eyes flamed. If he had at all hesitated in his approval of Butler's campaign, he now hesitated no more. The letter had an effect precisely the contrary of that intended by its writer. Instead of intimidating him, it kindled in him the spirit of battle. Have you any guess who the writer is? He said. None whatever. Then, noting the anger in Gaunt's face, he added, Now don't take it too seriously. I've received hundreds of such letters in my time. It may mean anything or nothing. It may be an idle threat or a serious menace. It is impossible to decide which. The only certain thing is that we've hit somebody pretty hard, and he's angry. But it's dastardly. Well, of course it is. You don't expect the devil to play fair, do you? What do you intend to do? Go on, just go on. In the course of a day or two, I shall begin a series of articles in the Daily Light. I shall use this letter later on, if the occasion demands it. It will be a valuable bit of evidence on the character of our opponents. We are in for a big fight, but I have not a doubt as to the issue. I know you think I have rather a poor opinion of human nature. Well, let me confess that I have one supreme faith. It is that the great multitude of plain folk are always on the side of right, when they once know what right is. That's a great creed, said Gaunt. It's a justified creed at any rate, said Butler. I've never found it false. There's an indistinguishable moral sense in man, in spite of all our philosophers. The curious thing is that it is most vital in the people who are the roughest and the most ignorant. As man goes up the social scale, he loses it. I suppose this is the result of wealth. All revolutions have their birth among the common people. It is from the womb of labor and hardship that all Christs come. It is the poor alone who have the vision to recognize the Christ when he does come. A day or two later, Butler began his memorial series of articles in the Daily Light. In his first article, he defined his policy. He began by stating that it was perfectly obvious and familiar to all American citizens, viz., that law had everywhere fallen into disrepute. It was notorious that a rich man had means of either coercing, buying, or influencing the law in his own favor. America was practically at the mercy of the rich men, many of whom were scoundrels of the worst kind. But if law failed to touch the lawbreaker, there still remained another tribunal, the tribunal of publicity. He proposed first of all to give a just and impartial account of the various abuses which worked injustice and suffering in common life. Those who were guilty would recognize their offenses in those articles. If the recognition of the offense produced penance and reparation, he was content. If no such results followed, he would proceed to publish the names of the offenders, with full details of their misdoing, and leave public opinion to deal with them in its own way. These articles at once produced furious comment in the yellow press. Both Butler and Gaunt were mercilessly caricatured and ridiculed. Who was Butler, jeered the press, that he should take it upon himself to be the censor of New York? They took leave to remind him that tyrannical Puritanism died a good many decades ago in New England, after making the life of the people miserable by its exactions, and that America would never permit its resurrection in the persons of a fanatical editor and a crack-brained parson. You see, said Butler, as he read this article to Gaunt, the writer of that anonymous letter was right when he said that he was perfectly aware of our plans and movements. I have not mentioned your name, but our antagonists recognize my manifesto as coming from the League of Service. I'm proud that they should do so, said Gaunt. All that I am afraid of is that some of our workers may be exposed to insult and violence, particularly the women. Oh, it hasn't come to that yet, and it won't for some time, said Butler. Of course it may happen, but I shall know well in advance. At present our antagonists will be content with ridicule of our motives and personal defamation. And we'll stop there for this week. Next week we'll continue The Pool and the River. Until then, take care, stay safe, and God bless.